For my first and potentially last video, I want to discuss the early 90s television show Northern Exposure. Surprisingly few people are aware of its existence despite critical acclaim in a primetime spot for 5 years straight, so to start, I'm going to give you an introduction to my point of view as a consumer and my personal history with the show. I will then summarize the show's setting and characters, discuss the themes of the series, and then conclude with its reception and my opinion of the show I remember. I say remember because I saw most of the episodes once over 10 years ago. So when I began making this video, I felt like it would be a disservice to rewatch or overanalyze a show that I loved when my tastes were very different. I also just wanted to see how much I could remember and not dive into my parents' fucking basement and try to dig out all the goddamn DVDs and play them on my Xbox. By the end of the video, I hope to generate interest in the series and shed some light on why you've probably never heard of it. I'm a moderately educated millennial from a small town, and I've always had this fantasy about running off into the woods and roughing it in a cabin. My parents entertained similar fantasies, but they took it a step further. They had this model log cabin dollhouse thing they'd constructed together before having children and never finished. A tiny mounted moose head sat in its original box on the floor next to the model's fireplace my entire life. My parents were also huge fans of this show called Northern Exposure. They eventually bought all the DVDs to the 6 seasons, but much like my parents' model cabin, I never finished watching the final season. You've probably never heard of the show because you're watching this video on your laptop, and Northern Exposure has never been available on any streaming services. To this day, it can only be legally viewed by buying the DVDs. My parents were super into it when it was broadcast on network television during the early 90s, but I didn't see an episode I can remember until about 2008. How would I describe Northern Exposure to someone who's never seen it? It's a comedy, with some dramatic bits. Magical realism comes to mind. It's like Parks and Rec in its ability to show you a wide array of interconnected lives, but it's also kind of like Scrubs. Not just because the protagonist is a doctor, but because he's young and transparent the same way JD is. But instead of having his inner dialogue and fantasies projected to the audience, he just kind of shouts all of his feelings out to an ambivalent Alaskan wilderness. So yeah, it's super 90s, and it's a compromise between Parks and Rec and Scrubs. But that sells it short a little bit. There's this third and crucial part of the equation that neither of those other two shows had going for it: the setting. Northern Exposure takes place in the most rural of fictional towns, Sicily, Alaska. The opening credits feature a live bull moose wandering undisturbed through town while cheeky harmonica music plays, and this gives the audience the feeling and tone of a far-off place that is so familiar but just a step outside their own reality. The story follows Joel Fleshman, protagonist in Fish Out of Water. He's just gotten out of med school and he travels to Anchorage to fulfill his contractual obligations to the state for their financial assistance with his education. But after some zany mix-up, he's sent off into the wilderness to suffer as the sole doctor of a one-horse town. Throughout the first 2 seasons, he's a whiny, educated, secular Jewish man from New York City. The action follows Joel, and every person in town has their character built up opposite of his. Maurice is the millionaire ex-astronaut trying to turn Sicily into a tourist mecca against the wishes of every citizen. He's American in a way Joel is not. He believes in business. He's somewhat elitist and is probably the most conservative person in town. Holling is the reformed mountain man from Canada who has traded in his gun for a camera. He's a really lovable guy and comes across so straightforward and rustic that he almost seems simple at times. He and Maurice sit opposite one another on the cowboy astronaut spectrum, and Joel gets to scratch his head between the two best friends. He also runs the local watering hole, and it's kind of the only place to go in town. Shelley is the young and beautiful girl Maurice had brought to Sicily before the series started, almost as a prize because he was the judge in some beauty pageant she won. Anyway, she falls for his best friend Holling, though, and puts their friendship on a season-long hiatus. As a young, hopeful woman diving into a seemingly insane relationship with a man 3 times her age, Joel can't relate to her easily at all. Joel's landlord and eventual lover is one Miss Maggie O'Connell. She chastises the city boy nonstop for the first season, but she eventually becomes his confidant in many things because the audience discovers she wasn't always just a bowl-cut bush plane pilot, but has a background of almost old money, gross point affluence. She sits opposite of Joel in that she chose to come to Sicily and she chooses to stay. Chris is the DJ at the only radio station in town. He's responsible for spreading all the local news, emergency notifications, and entertaining a diverse group of people with a limited amount of music. He almost serves as the narrator at times, like when he'll voice the audience's inner debate on air while a series of shots show us how all the characters are wrapping up their respective plots centered around a central theme. Chris spent time in prison and came from a relatively rough past, giving him this reformed bad boy vibe, and also a wildly different perspective from Joel's. Marilyn is Joel's Native Alaskan receptionist and only real help as a healthcare provider in town. She is as reserved as he is talkative. She has the rural hospitality that he lacks and occasionally points out something in a patient's demeanor that Joel missed or doesn't understand as an outsider. Ruth Ann is the wise old owner and operator of the general store where she sees and hears all. She's a widow, a mother of 2 grown and gone sons, and just a badass woman. Her advice for Joel is always sound, just because she's got so much time and just different life experience than he does. Ed Chigliak is mostly what I would call the meta relief. He's half Native Alaskan and an amateur filmmaker. He's somewhat strange in general because he seems so lost despite being in the place he was raised. He's never quite right in his own skin, no pun intended. Ed is younger and more open-minded than almost anyone on the show. Every episode pits these characters against one another emotionally, philosophically, and occasionally builds one or two of them towards a new perspective. It does all this while continually reinforcing the interconnecting relationships between them. Again, every character foils Joel and therefore the audience in their own special way. But as the show progresses, you kind of circle the drain around the soul of each citizen of Sicily before falling in love with their flaws. The audience learns about Alaska, life, and rural healthcare vicariously through him. By the end of the series, Joel has become an experienced doctor. A good doctor. And it almost seems like he needed to start out somewhere quiet to learn how to listen. I want to talk about the setting again. The show goes to great lengths to justify each character's presence at the end of the earth. And the show is called Northern Exposure, after all. Parts of it almost serve as a rural tourism public access program like Discover Wisconsin. Half the goddamn scenes transition with a wide angle of scenic woodland. Every interior shot is like going to Famous Dave's, but just for you. No other sweaty people staring at you with pork in their teeth. None of that sticky film shit that covers every surface in chain restaurants. Just the woodsy atmosphere and an endless amount of cabin memorabilia. The whole series is explored through a very geospecific lens. An episode that covers addiction takes place during the weeks that Sicily spends in darkness once a year due to its latitude. One of Joel's elderly friends becomes addicted to his vitamin D light visor and neglects other aspects of his health. Joel has to step in and take the visor from him, then dose it out to him every day with a stopwatch in hand, shattering the old man's independence and pride. Joel has to weigh what's best for his friend and what's best for his patient, in one of the very few places that can happen. We've covered characters and setting. Now let's get into the tone. I remember an episode where some sort of contaminant seeps into the groundwater of Sicily, making all the men exude feminine behaviors and the women do the opposite. I don't remember it being super thought-provoking and more of a men-be-like, women-be-like series of jokes. It certainly wasn't progressive by today's standards, but it was one of many identity episodes the show featured. Northern Exposure had one of network television's first gay marriages, and the episode was censored off some of the stations, especially in the South, when it was originally aired. I only mention this to say that it shows a lot of sides of many issues, and you won't agree with a lot of them. One of the central pillars of the show is the way the mind and heart play tricks on us. There's a ton of waxing philosophical and even more strange dream stuff, especially coming from Chris. There's an entire episode where he tries to rekindle an old flame, but each time he sees the object of his desire, she's played by a different and less attractive actress. When he finally tells her he's lost interest, she looks more beautiful than ever. There's an episode where all the characters embody people from the town's hypothetical and past, and explore what could have happened in an alternative timeline where the last surviving Romanov escaped the Russian Revolution and got smuggled to Alaska. I even think the episode goes as far as to say that she and her lesbian lover founded the town of Sicily in this hypothetical timeline. It's fuzzy. I use these examples to underline the magical realism of Northern Exposure. There's some blogs and forums comparing the show to Twin Peaks, which originally premiered only a few months before Northern Exposure. Twin Peaks only ran for 2 seasons in the 90s, but for some reason David Lynch's show was way more popular amongst people my age, even before it was revived through Netflix. An article entitled The Definitive Ranking of Twin Peaks Ripoffs Part 1, Northern Exposure, argues that serious surrealism wasn't as popular to a primetime audience in Twin Peaks, but a larger scoop of surrealism only added to the cute quirkiness of Sicily. It's interesting to see that Twin Peaks has become more popular than ever, while Northern Exposure has slipped into obscurity. So I already mentioned never having finished watching the show, and that's because early in the final season, Joel Fleshman, the protagonist, and I'd almost say audience cipher, leaves the series. Can you imagine a version of The Office where Jim convinces Pam to leave her high school sweetheart, he dates her for a few seasons, and then just fucks right off back to wherever he came from? That's basically how it felt after Joel and Maggie split, and my point of view left the show. My 16-year-old brain couldn't handle it and just shut it down for good. Joel's departure would be a great bookend to the series, but it was right in the meat of the 6th season, and I never knew why exactly. I'm sure this turned away many viewers such as myself, but it was apparently one of many nails in the coffin and not what ultimately ended the show. Huffington Post published an article in 2017 that illuminated some major licensing strife that came about towards the end. In 1994, Sandy Veith sued Universal/MCA Studios because he created a similar pilot series in the 80s and even optioned it with CBS. The similarities between Northern Exposure and Veith's show were so striking that he was awarded $7.5 million in the initial suit. More would have been forked over to him had the show continued production, and so the studio put it to bed. There's plenty of Hollywood buzz for a potential revival of the show. I imagine one feature-length episode or a limited series to promote its availability to be streamed on one of the services. Entertainment Weekly's website published an article in late 2018 about the show's potential to return. Hollywood Reporter had a similar article. So did Variety. All of these articles came out in November 2018, have almost identical information about the show being in development at CBS, and the biggest selling point in all of them seems to be that Rob Morrow, Joel Fleshman, is returning to the show. This seems to back up my assertion that the Doctor leaving was the end of the series for a lot of viewers. In 2013, Darren Burroughs put together a memoir about the show called Northern Exposed, Return to Sicily. His interviews with the surviving cast turned into a documentary of the same title. Even then, a revival had been discussed by some of the actors and potential producers. The whole series can be bought on DVD for a little over $100 through Amazon. There's even a special series pack that comes with a branded faux fur satchel bag. If there's a market for these things, I don't understand why Northern Exposure isn't already on one of the streaming services. Maybe there's still some legal reasons the show can be bought and sold on DVD but not licensed to Hulu, but I don't understand why, especially when Northern Exposure is easily pirated like everything else. It seems to be in the interest of the rights holders and residual recipients to make the show more accessible to an aging audience. God forbid they find any new viewers in the process. I highly recommend Northern Exposure to any and all. Few other shows made me relate to so many contradicting points of view, which may come across as trite to the woke Twitter crowd, but if we've learned anything recently, it's that the world changes a lot faster than people do. We don't have to look that far back to escape our reality and still see our reflection in another. The show is heartfelt and covers genuinely interesting topics. It made me want to see Alaska. It made me think about my place in the universe. And it made me want to belong to a community, a family, a tribe, more than any other fiction has. Northern Exposure gives you a cute, comedic, and surreal version of the 90s that you either need to remember or will never forget.